Hello, everyone. Welcome to another webinar. My name is Rich Martin, Senior Technical Marketing Engineer at Itential. And today we will be going over, talking about, and I'll show you how to integrate Infoblox with Itential for rapid DDI management. That's DHCP, DNS, and IP address management. So some of the main things we will be covering in the demo today is talking about the integration of Infoblox into Itential and integration in general. We try to make it very easy for your organization or any organization to integrate whatever it is in their ecosystem into Itential so they can start using it for automation. We'll take a look at some of the Infoblox API calls and kind of how to understand them and demystify them specifically for IP address management, querying, and requesting an IP address, as well as for some DNS management. In this case, being able to create an A record. And these are typically very, often asked about tasks that our customers want to do. But we'll take a look at the breadth of the Infoblox API calls, because there's a ton of them there. And all of those become available for automations. We'll also talk about how to query and transform data from Infoblox. One of the key concepts for automation, just in general, but specifically to the Itential platform, and it's universally a thing, is how when you do an API call into a system, any system, whether it's network, whether it's IT systems, Infoblox for today's example, that data gets we get a response back of that data. And if we're requesting an IP address, it's going to give us an IP address back that we can utilize. But in order to use that data for subsequent steps in the automation task, the data has to be manipulated. So we have to query data out from the responses, maybe from several sources, transform that data so that it can be used in subsequent steps, like making a change to an interface, or assigning an IP to a router, things like that. So we'll talk about that. We'll look at some basic transformation, and then talk about how transformations can grow more complex as you continue to grow and expand your automation workflows. And then we will automate network changes using that IP address data and do a DNS entry for the automation. And we'll do this in 3 primary steps. We'll start with the simple and kind of move into 2 other demo steps to show how this grows out over time. So when we're finished, we will be left with an automation that follows this rough example here. We'll get some data from a user. This is one source of truth for the information we need to make a network change. The other source of truth here is we need to query Infoblox for a new IP address to use. Again, we're going to transform that data using our data transformation task. We'll take a look at that, how it can manipulate data so that it can be used for a task to actually make the network change. We'll talk about, and I'll show you some ways to verify network changes, as well as we'll build upon the demonstration to do a DNS update, right? So a lot of times if we're assigning something that new, even if it's a network device or an application into the network, it needs a new IP address, but at the same time, there may be a requirement to create an A record for DNS as well. So for this, we will kind of tack on at the end, at the very last step, how to do those DNS A record creations, and then how to verify that result, doing a query back into Infoblox to at least get some information to verify if that A record was created. And then the demonstration ends. So with that, let me share my screen and we can get started. Okay, well, a demonstration for Infoblox really ought to start with Infoblox. So that's what we're looking at today. So for those of you who are familiar with this view, are also familiar with how to use it. And one of the things that I really want to focus on here, at least at the very beginning, is the fact that a lot of times now, when we think about network automation, we're thinking about how do we automate the network changes, right? But now consider this. Where does the data come from for all of those network changes? In this case, if we're going to, in this example, we're going to make a new network interface. Well, that IP information has to come from a source. In this case, it's Infoblox, right? So we're going to ask Infoblox to reserve an IP address in a pool. And in this example, I've created a pool. That pool is 10.1.1.0/24. So that's the network. And if I were to do this manually, this is something everybody does. if you're using Infoblox, you're probably already familiar with this. I can add an entry here. I'm not going to enable it in DNS yet. I can call this, since this is the first IP address in this usable IP address in this network, it could be called the gateway router. I'm going to have it use this IP and save and close. And I've basically just assigned this. Now the status went from unused to used. So now I've just assigned this, and now I can assign it to my gateway router. And if I were to make the network changes manually via CLI, or even using an automation, like Python, Ansible, something like that, I could now manually feed 10.1.1.1 as the IP address to be used for that. As well as if I needed to make a DNS entry, I've created infoblox.itential.com as a demo here. I could create a new DNS entry. We can call this gateway router. Add the IP address, 10.1.1.1, and save and close. And now I've created an A record for gateway-router.infoblox.itential.com that matches and points to 10.1.1.1. So I did all of that manually, right? Now consider this. If you're doing a network change that requires these two steps or more, perhaps, doing these things manually does take up a lot of time. And if you're looking at a backlog of network changes that require all these manual accesses into Infoblox for this information, either to acquire an IP address or to update DNS, and they're both related here, automating this piece of it is a big deal. In the way your automation strategy should be big enough to say, okay, maybe we start with network changes, but there's so much more to this process. And one of the first steps of the process is, where does my data come from? So that ought to be part of the automation strategy as you go forward. Yeah, absolutely. Automate the network task, the network changes that need to be made, but then go, okay, where does that network data come from? And let's automate those sources so that we can grab that data and manipulate it so that it can be used for the network change. And now you're saving more time and becoming even more efficient in your network automations. All right, so that was the manual example. So now let's drop into the first example of an automation. And I always want to start with kind of the simple and grow to the more complex. So when we start with the simple, I'm going to take you through just 3 simple steps. So in order to get an IP address from at least our instance of Infoblox here, I'm going to use 3 steps to get an IP address, right? The first step is to query. So this green box here comes from the Infoblox adapter. So when we integrate a system, I'm actually using an adapter. We have a pre-built library, and I'm going to show you that pre-built library at the end of this webinar demonstration. But that pre-built library includes things like adapters, it includes things like automations, and it includes data transformations. These are freely available to our customers. You can view them even without being a customer. They're on our GitLab page. And an adapter allows us to do an integration with a system. Now, we also have another methodology to integrate with IT systems or even network systems, and it always leverages APIs. So if a particular system, Infoblox, has a documented standard like in Swagger or OpenAPI, even a Postman collection, we can take that file and walk through a wizard in our platform to do an integration into that system, which would now make all of those API tasks available. And this is really useful because your ecosystem changes, right? Even within different versions of the same application. I know in our lab, we're running an older version of Infoblox. There's a newer version of Infoblox out. And so being able to, on your own, pull that information down from freely available API documentation and generating new integrations helps to make sure that you're always ahead of the game, ahead of the curve in the sense of being able to continually build automations, not just for networking, but to include all these IT systems as well, as sources of truth, as ticketing systems, messaging, notification systems, whatever is in your IP or your IT ecosystem. We want to make sure you are always capable of integrating those as you need. So we're leveraging here an adapter that's available, and it gives us access to a bunch of API calls. And so just to kind of scroll down, when you onboard and integrate a system, it becomes a part of our automation studio canvas. That's what you're looking at here, where you can build your own workflows that can be run as an automation. And you kind of just take elements from the different systems and network systems and IT systems that you onboard and plug them into the workflow as steps, as tasks, we call them, or steps in the workflow. And it starts here. So how we get an IP address, basically you get all of these Infoblox API calls available to you, but really, because every system is different, it's really important for vendors to upgrade or to update their documentation to help identify the proper ways to use their API calls. And a lot of vendors nowadays, and for IT systems, are doing a great job at it. And Infoblox does a really good job. So let me show you the reference guide for their REST API. This is something, as you're going to integrate with different IT systems, it's good to be able to locate this. Usually it's publicly available and you can download it. But in the case here, they give you a very good opportunity to look at the table of contents and not only see how these API calls are laid out, but actually give you working examples. So that's one way to help understand how these things work. So if I wanted to get an IP address, I could go straight down to here and say, right here, get unused IP address in a subnet. If I click on that, it'll take me to the actual REST API call. So now I can see the data elements that are required for this. So it's looking like it's going to pass a very specific, a very specific, let me go back. Page 70, here we go. A very specific network, 10.0, whoops, 10.0.0, 10.10.0/24, and it's going to get a response back. Now that gives us the information and clues so that we know not only what API calls to get, but what to expect to pass and in response. So that's one way. Here's another way that I think it's also very important as you're starting to build out automations is if you're just a user of the application itself. So if I go back into this, recall when I created this manually, it requires a certain amount of data, right? So number one, it needs to know, well, what network view am I using default? What network am I actually manually here wanting to reference to reserve an IP, even if it's manually? I have to go to that particular view, and then I actually have to click on the IP address and everything like that and fill out the forms. That data is usually represented as part of the API calls too. So being a user helps you understand how to leverage API calls. The documentation helps you understand it. And a third part is, I'll show you at the end of this too, is a lot of the work we've done for pre-built automations help you understand how these API calls work, so you can leverage them very, very quickly. So in this case, the process is like this. First, we ask the Infoblox server for this particular network. Now, if I double click here, I am passing the network reference that I've created for this demo. So the block needs to be in 10.1.1.0/24. Give me the next available IP address for that. When that call is completed, it's going to return some data, but that data can't directly be used in the next Infoblox API adapter call, which is to reserve that IP address. And in fact, it has to be transformed and modified. So part of that data will be returned in the first call, but not all of it. So we have to now extract, manipulate, and create the data required to actually create the object that reserves the IP address in Infoblox. And that's the key for data transformation. So when you see JST, we call it JSON schema transformation, because we represent everything as a JSON schema within our platform. But it's the way of transforming data. So let's take a look at what this transformation looks like. It's called Webinar Infoblox Demo 1. So if I click on here, this goes to a designer. So it's very similar to building an automation workflow. It's a drag and drop with elements on the right. These elements are different ways to manipulate data. And so I'll just quickly kind of cover all the main elements here and what we're doing, the whole process. So on the left-hand side, we define an incoming schema. This just says, hey, this is the data we expect to come in. And this data comes from that first Infoblox API call to get an IP address for a particular network. Now, remember that data we're going to get a response from that API call, and it's going to follow this data format. It's a particular data format that we've captured from an API call, so we know what the data format is. And the information in that data is important to us, but we have to extract it. So if you look here in the response data, there's a field called IPs. This is actually a list of IP, an array or a list of IP addresses. Now we're only asking for a single IP, the next available IP with this API call. So we really need the first element, which starts with the element 0 in a list. So instead of 1, right? This is more programmatic in that sense. So we use a call called getIndex, which comes from these areas here, these methods. I can drag them in and I can map that array into here and now extract just that first element. And now that gets returned out and I can map it to what's called an outgoing schema. Now this outgoing schema is the data format that we're going to pass into the second Infoblox API call to actually reserve the IP address. So the first call identifies the IP address. So it's like a query. Tell me the next IP address that can be used. We manipulate that data here and put it in a format that now I can go back to Infoblox and say, okay, reserve that IP address for our use. Now, it also needs some other information. This is required for the API call. It's in the documentation. What is that information? I've got it mapped into the schema here. We need a name. This is the name that, so when I created that one manually for the router gateway, this is that name. So in this case, I'm statically assigning a name just for test purposes here in this first step. Infoblox-test123. It's going to require a MAC address. So in this case, since I'm testing and this is not really used for DHCP in our test lab, I'm just going to give it a blank MAC address of zeros. It's going to need a field called network view. Network view is, in this case, default. I'm going to set it default, but this is how you identify which network view that you're wanting to reference with the IP address. So I'm using default here since that's our basis. And then finally, the last piece here is the network. So this is the actual network subnet that I want to reserve the IP address in. So it has to match the IP address, obviously, that we get back from the original call. And so when all that data is put together and extracted and transformed, we're going to return this object with all the data required for that second API call here. So if I double click this is how we reference all that information. So we've created in the JST, that transformation, and then these are the variables that are required for this Infoblox call called create object. In this case, we're creating an object. That object, as defined by their documentation, Infoblox's documentation, is called a fixed address. This is a fixed IP address that we want to reserve. And in this case, we got to return all of that data. Where does that data come from? It comes from a task called webinar Infoblox demo 1. And the variables are found in something called reserve IP address. Now, where does that come from? That's our transformation. That's the reference to our transformation task, webinar Infoblox demo 1. And if we go back to our transformation mapping here, that variable is called reserve IP address. And that's where all of that data comes from. So now if we run this, even though this is kind of statically done, we'll be able to see this go step by step. Now it'll go quickly because these API calls are very, very fast. But let's go to the visualize, and now we can see this. So I showed you how the automation is built step by step. Now we can actually see the data that's getting passed between everything. So we'll start with the first task. So recall, this was the task where we're asking Infoblox to give us the next open IP address for a particular network. So we had to pass to it the network that we want to ask for an IP address. So 10.1.1.0/24. So with that reference, it sent data back to us, right? So this is the response data, meeting that format that I showed you in the transformation task. And in this case, the response was, here's a list of IPs. In this case, we only asked for one for this by this particular API call, but it did give us an IP address of the next available one, which is 10.1.1.2. Now, just because we've received that, think of it as a query, doesn't mean we've actually reserved it yet. So we have to do that. That's our second call here into Infoblox. But before we do that, we had to transform that data so it could be put in a format that's usable by the second task. So how did we do that? We captured that data. So we passed that data from the first API task. Remember, this is the thing we're trying to extract from that. we did those transformation steps, and the result coming out of the API, the transformation task, that middle step, is the format that's needed for that next task. And here's the data. Here's the IP address that we captured from the first API call into Infoblox. And then here's the data we statically assigned within the transformation. And now that's kind of packaged up and ready to go to pass to this step, which actually does the reservation in Infoblox. So let's take a look at the incoming data. Recall that we had to tell it what object to create. This, in this case, it's a fixed address based on their documentation. And then we pass to it the data that we've created in our transformation. So this fulfills the API requirements. And then when it's responding, it gives us a response code of 201, which is a success that it's created. And it gives us the result of that new entry in the IPAM for it. So we can take a look at that now. So let me go back into Infoblox. So here's our 10.110/24. If I do a refresh, you'll see that that little automation that we created, a 3-step automation, was able to query for this open IP, transform the data, and then actually reserve it with the right information that we created inside of the automation. So that's how you start off. You start off basically building an automation, understanding the different calls that are required for the needs of that maybe bigger automation. So now we want to actually make a network change. And now we can use some of that information for that network change. So now let's build upon that demo. And this gets a little more complex, but look right here. These 3 steps are what we just walked through. We're going to get the same information, get the next available IP. We're going to transform that data, and we're going to reserve that IP. Now, let me show you over here. This step is actually making the network change. But in order to make that network change, all I really get from the Infoblox adapter here is the next IP address and the net mask, right? So if I look here, if I open up this particular task that actually inflicts that network change, it needs more data. And where does that data come from? It's going to come from our data transformation task. So in this case, I've augmented the data transformation tasks to output the variables that this needs, but there has to be a second source of information, because again, the Infoblox request for an IP address really only covers these 2 pieces of information, IP and net mask. So where does this other information need to come from? And this is a great opportunity to talk about different sources of truth. Consider when you're making a network change, where does all that data come from? In this case, it could come from a number of sources, right? Your IP address could come from Infoblox, the router that you're going to make a change on, which is the host field, the interface, the description. That could come from an inventory system. It could come from a spreadsheet. It could come from a lot of sources, right? You have to gather that data somewhere. And ideally, that data is available through some system that we can integrate with. But if not, you have to input that data somewhere. But the concept here is that a lot of times making even the simplest network change requires data from multiple sources. So one of the easiest ways to do that here in a demonstration is to pull that data from a user form, some form that pops up and allows somebody to input data into it. So that's what we've done here. So I've added a second source of that information from a data form. And what does a data form look like? It looks like this. So this is a form that you can create. Again, it's very similar. You get a canvas, and we can drag and drop elements from the right to create a form that now can pop up when this automation is executed, so users can enter information. And we're asking for the device, so in this case, the router, to make the network change. An interface name, we're going to use loopback 301. A description, so this is a port description. And then a host name. So this is for DNS. Okay, so I'm adding a host name here so that we can also, in the next part of the demonstration, that next step, to extend it to do a DNS update into Infoblox as well. So this is a form I've created, and that's what this step does here. So when you see a blue step in an automation workflow in our platform, it actually stops the automation and asks for user input. So I've got 2 of them here. This one exists so that we can input data into that form that we created. Then that data will be used here in this transformation, but we're also getting the next available IP from the Infoblox adapter. This transformation is going to transform that data so that it has the right format to reserve the IP, and also the right data format in order to configure the network interface. So now we're actually doing some network configuration, and this alleviates us from having to do the manual step of going to the Infoblox dashboard and doing the manual allocation, copy and pasting it into something there. So again, we're trying to make our network automations more efficient. I inserted this view data task just as a pause so that we can look at all these systems and ensure that everything's working correctly. It wouldn't normally be there in a end-to-end automation. And then after the network is configured, we do something called, we run a command template. If you've watched some of our previous automation webinars, we've spent some more time on command templates and why they're important. But generally speaking, this is a great opportunity to do a post check, and especially for networking teams who may not have a background in doing a lot of automation or having a programming background, because a command template takes the form, and here's a command template that I'm running, takes the form of a series of CLI commands. So I always look at it this way. If you know, in my previous life as a network engineer making network changes, even today, I want to go back and after a network change is made, ensure that, you know, that network change is being, not only it took, but it's actually it's functioning the way it's supposed to function. So a lot of times what you're doing is you're doing a series of show commands on the same router, perhaps, if we're assuming a CLI management context here, making it CLI command change, going and doing a series of show commands to verify that that's exactly what's going on, that in the show commands, not only does it show up, but even operationally, it says, you know, in certain cases, you know, that it says it's operating correctly. So in this case, it's a simplified thing, but I wanted to ensure that everybody recognized that, you know, best practice is to do a series of validations or verification steps after you make a change, you know, that this is kind of your post check. So in this case, I'm just simply executing show interface, and this is a variable, right? So this is the variable that's going to come from our data transformation. Remember, data transformation gathers data and puts it in the format for subsequent tasks. So this command template is a subsequent task. So it's going to get the variable that we've input for this particular loopback interface and reference it here. And all it's doing is it's going to execute this command, and then it's going to parse out the input to see if that network interface is up, right? So this is exactly what a networking engineer would look at. If I've created the interface, if the interface is up, it's got an IP address, it's working. If I do a show on that interface, it should say that, you know, the interface is up and ideally the line protocol is up. Again, this can be extended to as many commands as you want. It can be very complex, and it's one way or one route to create a very robust post-check process. So we're getting the user data. We're pulling in information for the next IP address from Infoblox. We're actually reserving it. So that's the query. That's the application here. We're applying it. Now we're going to make the network change. We'll verify that the network change is made. If that's success, then we'll end. And in the case that something fails, you can have a rollback procedure. Now we're not going to use it here, but that's always best practice, right? If something goes bad, doesn't happen the way it ought to have, you should have a rollback procedure. And in that case, that could be another workflow that goes back and gathers the data from the previous steps to roll back the changes to the state where it was. That could be your network configuration on a particular router, and it can be rolling back changes to the Infoblox server as well, like deallocating an IP address or even removing an IP, you know, a DNS entry if that's were the case needed. Okay, so I think we're good here. We've stepped through there. We built upon our 3. We've added the second source of truth, updated that transformation. So we should be able to run this. And see now that we can make some network changes along with the data gathering process. So the first step was data gathering. Remember that first step was blue task, which means we have to input something. So we're going to make a change to a router called core ATL0 on loopback 301. We'll give it a description. In this case, it could be webinar demo 2. This is for DNS. We're not going to do a DNS entry here, but it's in the form for the next step. But in this case, we could, you know, insert It could be something like gateway router demo 2. So when I hit confirm, now that data along with the data from, we'll go to visualize view here so we can kind of see it a little better. So when I hit confirm, that data was now available for this transformation task. Now before that transformation task, we went and asked the Infoblox server for the next available IP from this subnet. It responded back with 10.1.1.3. Now that goes into the transformation. So if we look at the data, this is, of course, this is as it's run already. We can see the incoming data. So this is the data from the Infoblox information. And this is the data from the form that I created. So now I've got two data sources going into the same transformation task so that when I output everything, not only do I have the information required for the reservation of the IP address, but I also have a bunch of information here available for updating a DNS record and updating the network change automation. So it has all the information it needs as well, all done through that single data transformation task. So now we reserve the IP address. Remember, the first step was to query it. This comes from the data transformation. This is the response back from the reservation. It gives us a success code, and it gives us a result that identifies this new allocation, 10.1.1.3. And now we're sitting at the verify IP address. That just gave us an opportunity to pause. So if I go into manual tasks here, I can work that pause task and move it forward. So if I hit continue, now we can go back to visualize and we can see the rest of it running. So now it's actually doing the network change. So all of the data required to actually make the network change came from our user form as a source of truth. This could have easily come from, like I said, another inventory system that you had that was available, or even another application that can be passed data to a workflow here, because these things can be published as APIs themselves and input data. But the point is, multiple points of data required for a simple network change, and being able to aggregate that data, query it, transform it so that it can be used for everything subsequent to that. So now that that network change is complete, let's take a look at the data we passed to it. So again, this came from the transformation task. It needed the name of the router to make the change, the interface to make the change on, a port description. So this is what we entered into the form, recall, and then the IP address and the net mask. That IP address came from the Infoblox server. And then the response back from this network change script was success. And then it went through the network verification change process. We're passing to it the variables it needs. It needed to know the loopback, and it needed to know the host name to do the CLI checks on, and the results of those CLI checks for, is that interface up? Show that interface. Is the interface up, and is the line protocol up? Came back as true, so that it saw that and passed, and the entire thing completed. So now let's go back and verify. So the first thing let's verify is the reserve IP address. So we got the IP address, and we can see again here, 10.1.1.3 was the IP address that was reserved. So let's go back into our Infoblox system here, 10.1.1.3, gateway router demo 2. So that's the, from the form, that's what I inputted there. And now if we go to the device itself, that was core ATL 0. We can load the live configuration. So this is Configuration Manager, where you can onboard an inventory of your devices that you want to automate and do config compliance, config templates and compliance on it. But we can actually see the live config here. And interface loopback 301, here it is, 10.1.1.3, that came from Infoblox, with the port description that we put in, webinar demo 2, as part of this second demo. Okay. So if we go back and look at this, we can see where we started with the 3 simple tasks for querying data, IP address data from Infoblox, added a second source of truth, moved forward to actually make the network change, had a task to verify and make sure everything looked good. So what's the third step? Well, the third step is let's add to this a little bit more. And what is that little bit more? Creating an A record. So this happens all the time too. If you're adding things to a load balancing pool, or adding a load balancer itself, or different network devices or applications. Your automation may need to access and update DNS records. If you're doing those by hand, so let's say you have a network automation, and but you're doing things like identifying and reserving IP addresses by hand, or going and reserving and or defining A records in your DNS by hand. If that's an entire backlog process, your automation strategy needs to include the ability to integrate these systems like Infoblox, if that's what you're using, and then build into the network change the data gathering, right, piece of it, right, the data transformation, and any kind of subsequent things that need to happen that correlate, or in some cases absolutely necessary for this new service or application to work. In this case, it could be DNS. So that's what we've done here. So everything from this step over to here is exactly what we've done already. We've just built on a couple of extra steps here. So the first step is we want to create an A record. So that's a DNS record. That information is going to come from, again, our transformation task. In this case, I've updated the transformation task to be able to build that data. We'll take a look at what that data looks like. And it's a field or a variable called update DNS record. After that, I'm doing another pause here just so we can kind of take a step back and look at things, make sure they work, because that's going to create that. So we'll be able to pop back into Infoblox to take a look and make sure that got created. And then, just as important, because your automation may require this, you need to be able to query the Infoblox system for a particular DNS record. And in this case, that data that we're going to pass to it comes from the same transformation task. It's the full DNS name that we've just created. So in this case, we'll create the DNS record, and this is kind of like a validation step. Did the DNS record get created? The response value is going to say yes, but it's always nice to be able to build a more robust one. And so if your automation requires it or needs it, you can have a bunch of queries of different systems and routers and things like that. So again, being able to validate, verify that changes were made, whether it's on the network, right, with things like command templates, or whether it's in different IT systems like Infoblox. All right, so that's it. It just builds upon those second steps to show how you can create additional steps in your automation for the different functions of Infoblox, like DNS. So with that, we should be able to run this and go through that same process again. So this is the job view. The first step, recall, was the task to ask us data input. So that's why the work is, the automation is kind of paused there. We're going to keep everything the same for now, but for the description, we can do NAR demo 3. This is the port description on the router that's going to be set. And then now the host name, this is for the DNS, and the IP address, the IPAM allocation as well, but it's also going to be mapped back to DNS as well. And for host name, this could be a gateway router for, a service or a customer. Demo 3. There we go. Now that I've clicked that, it's going to continue on with the automation. And you can see where it's on now. It's at this other manual task waiting for us, giving us a pause so that we can take a look at everything that's going on here. So we inputted our data into a form. We got the next IP address from a live API call into Infoblox. So let's take a look at that. We're requesting that IP from that same subnet. So it should give us the next IP available. It did. 10114 is the IP. That now, as well as the information from our form, goes into our transformation. That transformation that, is parsing through two sources of information, the form, just like I said, and the call into Infoblox that returned that next IP address. So that's the response. The output of that, the outgoing schema of that, is now all of the data we need for these subsequent API calls and network change tasks. So here's the reserve IP address information, this next IP and net mask, host and interface name and description are for the network change itself. This is the information required for updating a DNS record. So we're going to create a new DNS record. That's what we're adding into this automation. So that transformation task has been updated to include that now. And then our query. So remember, our last step here is to query the DNS for the A record that we just created. Now that query in our transformation task, I've created a transformation to now output the full name for the task, so that it can query this particular name and come back with a response. So now that we've been through that, let's continue this on. So if I go to manual tasks, I can go forward from that manual task, go back to visualize. Now, again, it's making the network changes, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. After that, it'll go through the verify network change step and then create the A record for the DNS, and then it'll pause again. So again, this is executing a series of CLI commands. So it's completed that. So we can take a look at this. So it's gone to this particular router, right? This came from our form. This is the IP address from our Infoblox query, 10114. And here it's told us that it successfully updated that interface and created it with that information, which we'll check in a minute on the actual device. It went through the network change through the template. Now let's take a look at this create a record, since this is new. So in this case, we're passing this data to it. Again, how do you understand how these Infoblox calls? So this is an Infoblox API call. How do they work? You have to reference the documentation. We do a good job of reading that documentation through integrations, assuming that it's documented well itself, right? Because this is something that the vendor publishes themselves. But their documentation is always a great source. Infoblox does a really good job. And so you'll see when you look up these particular calls that they require certain information. In this case, if I want to create an A record, I need to know, well, what is the A record I need to create, right? And it infers the domain from here. And then what's the IP address that it needs to point to for that A record? And that's a minimal amount of information we need. And so given that, you pass that data into the actual API call, and it comes back with a response. That's 200 response, so it's successful. And it tells us that it has created that particular record now. And we'll take a look at that in a minute. Now, we're paused here because we want to pause before the validation or verification query. So if I work task and move this along, we should now go back to here, and it's completed the query task. So did it actually create that record, that DNS record? That's what the query task does, is it looks at that as a validation check. So what do we pass to it? This comes from our transformation task, which is the full host and domain name that we want to query for. And it came back with a success. It found it. And in this case, it returned the record that it's allocated for it in the system, as well as some of the details that were assigned to it. So in this case, here's the IP address that it points to. And here is the full name, which we knew. And it sits in the default network view. So we can go back now, and the first thing we can do is, well, let's go back to here and see what the last IP address was. So 10114, you'll see this is where we assigned that host name from our form. And then when we created the A record, Infoblox automatically allocates and associates that with a DNS entry if it exists for that IP address. So that means if I pop over to DNS now for this, you'll see the A record that we created here for 10114. And then finally, if I refresh this, let's pull the live configuration and take a look at loopback 301 again, and it should reflect 311 or 10114. And right here, loopback 301 from our form on this particular device. Here's the description that we typed in from the form, and the IP address is what we got from the Infoblox API call. All right, so hopefully that was useful for you. Let me show you one last thing before we end this. I mentioned that as you build integrations into your network automations, your network change automations, it's important to not only integrate these systems, which we try to make it very easy for our customers to do, but to also understand how these API calls function, because there can be quite a few of them. Within our application itself, right, we have the ability to show you some of that information that we gather from either the adapter or the API documentation through an integration. If they're using Open API, we pull that documentation information so that you can, it makes it easy for you to understand. We talked about being able to reference the Infoblox, in this case, API reference guides. And most vendors have a pretty good reference guide for their API calls, because this is also going to tell you the proper ways to make these particular API calls, what data is required, what variables need to be set, those kind of things. So that's always good to reference as well. Talked about just using the application makes you aware of some of the required data elements as well. So all of these create the foundation. But the last thing I want to show you is that getting started fast, especially for network automation teams or networking teams that need to get into automation without a lot of prior background, is important to us. So if you come to our website, I mentioned this earlier. If we go to our pre-built collection, this is where we have a library of pre-built adapters. So that's integrations into different systems like Infoblox, which we use today. Data transformations. So those transformations that I showed you were critical for manipulating, querying, and manipulating information from your sources of truth, so that that data can be used in subsequent tasks like network change tasks, our DNS update, our IP address reservation. All that data came from a transformation. And we publish automations. And here's what's key. For Infoblox, we have a bunch of DNS management pre-built automation. So customers can, within our platform, integrate this pre-built library of automations. And this is a full-featured create, modify, delete, all kinds of records using automations, updating all kinds of DNS records, integrating with Infoblox. So this comes with a host of useful features that you can, useful automations that you can use immediately. But this, again, is another way for you to understand how these things work. So this has been onboarded here into this platform. So if I go and if I search for Infoblox here, you'll see that DNS management. What I just showed you in our documentation, our pre-built collection, is right here. So this is live and now could be run within the platform. So you could literally download this into your platform and start working with it. But it also helps you to understand how the API calls work. And it gives you a lot of pre-built things that you can call on your own without having to build it from scratch. So again, this becomes another method as you learn to build your network automations that include these sources of truth. Check out our pre-built collection, see the work that's been done, and now you can pull that into your system and not only start to use that immediately for like in this case for DNS management, but then you can actually start to take a look at how these are built to understand the underlying components and API calls needed for any particular tasks or API calls for Infoblox. And that is also applicable for any of the other systems that we have pre-built integrations, adapters, or automations for. Well, there's quite a few. So with that, I just want to say thank you. Hopefully this was helpful in your automation journey, especially on the networking side, to understand that gathering the data and manipulating that data from all these different sources and IT systems is important. And we know Infoblox is a very prevalent system, especially for network teams that they use on a day-to-day basis. So in order to make your network automations more effective, your automation strategy needs to be able to include the integration into the system for these calls, so you don't have to do these things manually. You don't have to copy and paste. And ultimately, it's going to make you, your organization, and your business more efficient. Thank you very much, and I will speak to you next time.